Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice. I'm Terry Dennis, and I'll be chairing the meeting this evening. With us tonight, we have Mr. Gary Grewell, Mr. Travis Kiesig, we have Jim LeMaig filling in for Lisa Lambert, Tim McLeod, Hugh Nerlin filling in for Greg Ottenbright, and we have Nicole Sauer sitting in for Erica Ritchie. I want to welcome people here tonight watching the committee. This is your legislative assembly, so it's good to have everybody here tonight to observe the committee's work. I want to remind you that you are not a participant in the committee at the work tonight. Before we get going, we'll begin today's business. I would like to table the following documents: IAJ 10-29, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council, 2021 bylaws filed. Yep. Is that agreed? No. Or go through them all? Sorry. Okay. IAJ 11-29, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council, 2022 bylaws filed. IAJ 12-29, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council, 2021 regulations filed. IAJ 13-29, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council, 2022 regulations. Filed, sorry. Okay, now.
Okay, yeah. No.
No. Oh, sorry. Yeah, today we'll consider two bills, Bill 88, the Saskatchewan First Act, and Bill 102, the Constitutional Questions Amendment Act, 2022, a bilingual bill. We'll break for 45-minute recess.
At 6 p.m.
Yes. So?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your three motions that I would like the committee to consider prior to us discussing the substantive bill. I will move the first motion, and I do have copies for the minister as well. My first motion, I would move that the committee invite a representative from each of the following entities to present to the committee on the subject of Bill 88 at a future meeting of the committee. A, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. B, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. C, Agency Chiefs Tribal Council. D, Battleford's Tribal Council. E, File Hills Capel Tribal Council. F, Meadow Lake Tribal Council. G, Prince Albert Grand Council. H, Saskatoon Tribal Council. I, Southeast Treaty No. 4 Tribal Council. J, Touchwood Agency Chiefs. And K, Yorkton Tribal Council.
Ms. Sauer has moved the motion. Will members take the motion as read? Is that agreed? Take it as agreed? Is the motion agreed?
On division. Okay.
No on division?
So now sign, date, and write denied on that.
Today.
March 15th. Denied.
Ms. Sauer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My second motion, I move that the committee invite each of the following constitutional experts to present to the committee on the subject of Bill 88 at a future meeting of the committee. A, Dwight Newman, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. B, Howard Leeson, Regina, Saskatchewan. C, Marilee Rasmussen, Regina, Saskatchewan. D, Norman Zlotkin, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. E, John White, Regina, Saskatchewan. And F, Mark Carter, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
Ms. Sauer has moved the motion. Will members take the motion as read? Agreed? That's agreed.
No, it's the motion.
Is the motion agreed? Yes. No by division? Denied by division.
Yeah.
Ms. Sauer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a third and final motion. I move that the committee recommends that the government refer Bill 88 to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal under the Constitutional Questions Act 2012 in order to obtain an opinion regarding the bill's constitutionality.
This is the last one, eh?
Yeah, last.
Ms. Sauer has moved the motion. Will members take the motion as read? Agreed. Is the motion agreed? No. Denied by division.
On division.
On division, sorry. We will now begin Bill 88, the SAS First Act, Clause 1, short title. Ms. Eyre is here with her officials from the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General. I would ask the officials to please state their name for the record before speaking and do not touch the microphones. Hansard will turn them on and speak for you. Ms. Eyre, please make your opening comments and introduce your officials.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with me, Kylie Head, KC, Acting Deputy Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Mitch McAdam, KC, Director, Constitutional Law Branch, Ministry of Justice and Attorney General, and Darcy McGovern, KC, Director, Legislative Services Branch, Ministry of Justice and Attorney General behind me, and my Chief of Staff, Ashley Boha. So thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. I'm pleased to offer opening remarks on Bill 88, the Saskatchewan First Act. And I was at the College of Law recently talking about the Act, and I was recalling how in the mid-90s, when I was a law student, the Quebec referendum, of course, had happened in 1995. The Charlottetown Accord talks of 1992 were still being processed, and the whole issue of how much provincial decentralization Canada actually should have. And it struck me that there are a number of variations on themes that we are still talking about, which relate back or forward to the issues and themes around the Saskatchewan First Act, which of course I'm here to talk about today. First off, the question, what this act is it constitutional? Yes, it is. The Act asserts Saskatchewan's exclusive jurisdiction over natural resources, namely the exploration, development, conservation, management, and production of those natural resources, including forestry, as well as facilities for the generation and production of electrical energy. We felt that it was important to assert that jurisdiction within our provincial constitution and to enumerate core provincial powers, which we believe has real, practical, but also legal weight. Those core provincial powers include the regulation of all industries and businesses falling within Saskatchewan's exclusive jurisdiction. And we're seeing a lot of federal overreach in that area, Mr. Chair. And the regulation of fertilizer use in Saskatchewan, including application, production, quantities, and emissions. In other words, the day-to-day business of farming. And that came up today at SARM. Question from the floor, is the federal government coming after fertilizer? Mr. Chair, we are amending Saskatchewan's constitution by virtue of Section 45 of the Constitution Act 1982, which provides that a provincial legislature can unilaterally amend its own constitution. And we are amending both the Saskatchewan Act and Part 5 of the Constitution Act 1867. Keep in mind, not all parts of the Saskatchewan Act are part of the Constitution Act. We can't, for example, under the Saskatchewan Act, unilaterally amend our provincial boundaries, but we could change our provincial seat of government. Not that we are intending to. The point is, each covers different areas. So we determined in the end that we would amend both. And just for the record, in 2021, the Prime Minister explicitly stated that provinces have the power to unilaterally amend their constitutions. Quote, "It is perfectly legitimate for a province to modify the section of the Constitution that applies to them," end quote. Just as Quebec did. We are not adding new powers to the legislature. In Section 3 of our Act, we are merely asserting and enumerating the province's exclusive powers. In terms of what the Act is not, it is not about separation. It is not about gratuitous Fed bashing. It's about being an honourable partner and being treated as an honourable partner by the federal government when it comes to protecting exclusive provincial jurisdiction, just as there is exclusive federal jurisdiction. This Act is not about copying Alberta, which followed our Act and is in fact quite different. And importantly, it is not a violation of treaties or of duty to consult with our First Nations partners. There are amazing things happening in our First Nations communities in the energy sector, the forestry sector, the mining sector. No one wants to jeopardize any of that. We want to protect the work, this work, and what's happening in the First Nations communities across the province in these sectors. And meeting with our Indigenous partners, I have said, and I will continue to say, the fact that the provinces, all provinces, have exclusive jurisdiction is not our language. It is the language of the Constitution. It is the language of the division of powers. It is the same exclusive jurisdiction we fought the federal carbon tax over. It is what we're fighting Bill C-69 over. These didn't formally trigger duty to consult either. Treaty rights are enshrined in Section 35 of the Constitution Act, the same Constitution Act that enshrines 92A, the exclusive jurisdiction of all provinces over natural resources. In our case, 92A is important language when it comes to protecting economic growth and strength and fostering opportunity for everyone. Let's also not forget that it was Alan Blakeney with Peter Lougheed who in 1981-82 pushed to have provincial exclusive jurisdiction over natural resources. That language inserted under 92A to begin with as a way to balance powers with the federal government. So the division of powers and the constitutional dance, if you like, has been going on for a long time. If you disagree with the division of powers under the Constitution, the same Constitution that also protects treaty rights, that is way beyond one province to address. That would be a very substantial constitutional issue. So, Mr. Chair, what drives the Act? What's the why? Fundamentally, the fact that the federal government continues to infringe provincial exclusive jurisdiction and hurt economic growth. The economic success that we've achieved in this province has been despite federal policies that have done real economic harm and risk doing much more. And the main point is that that economic harm is primarily being perpetrated on just one region of the country, the West. Some examples. The federal government wants to transition to no fossil fuel generated power by 2035. Literally impossible, according to SaskPower. As the head has said, we are going as fast as we can. There's not a lot of hydro in this province. SaskPower is implementing more wind and solar all the time. There's no doubt 2036 is going to be a chilly year, considering the city of Saskatoon, as just one example, is run by natural gas at the Queen Elizabeth Power Station. Another example, the federal government's Bill C-69, which the Court of Appeal of Alberta called a wrecking ball to, again, exclusive jurisdiction under 92A of the provinces. Bill C-69 isn't just bad for pipelines and any interprovincial projects. It killed off the Saguenay liquid natural gas facility. Liquid natural gas, which right now our democratic allies around the world need. Germany, Japan, Canada can't help them. And then there's the carbon tax. Exclusive provincial jurisdiction under 92A trumped by the federal power under peace, order, and good government. And it definitely causes economic harm. The federal parliamentary budget officer testified before a federal committee last year that as a result of the carbon tax, at least 60% of Canadian households are financially worse off. And, of course, the wider economy is impacted as indirect costs are passed on to people by businesses. The PBO also reminded us that Saskatchewan producers will be paying $28 million a year in carbon tax for grain drying alone by 2030. And consider, producers are hit at every turn. Every farmer is paying carbon tax every time product comes onto their farm, but also when it's shipped out, on inputs during seeding, harvesting, drying the grain, as I mentioned, shipping it, on utilities to process it, on transporting the grain or other product to a further stage processor, a wheat miller, for example. Then on utilities for milling the wheat, delivering the flour to a bakery, on utilities at the bakery, and finally on delivering the bread to a grocery store. Also this year, Mr. Chair, 2023, the federal government is introducing new fuel standard regulations. They've largely fallen under the radar, partly because they're regulations, not legislation, but they really are carbon tax number 2. We predict, and the federal government has never contradicted us on this, that these regulations will have an impact of at least $700 million a year on both gas consumption and diesel consumption in our province. Just one set of regulations, and a huge impact on retail, rail, the ag sector, trucking, manufacturing, and of course, heating your home and fueling your car. The point is, all these federal policies hurt us and affect us economically. Our natural resources are one of the major reasons why Saskatchewan is weathering the economic recessionary storm being experienced elsewhere. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when you have strong, competitive, transparent, regulatory and royalty structures, and you pound the pavement trying to attract investment, as we have. Economic success happens when you don't turn your back on workers in traditional sectors, when you build on those sectors and strengths and diversify and expand into new areas: helium, lithium, rare critical minerals. Economic success happens because you create a pro-business, pro-investment climate. This bill is about ensuring and protecting that. In terms of other examples, of course, we're also hearing about the new proposed federal Just Transition Bill, except it's been renamed Sustainable Jobs Bill or something. We've also all heard about the 81-page report from the Federal Department of Natural Resources and how some 3 million Canadians in the industrial workforce, agriculture, food processing, oil and gas, mining, manufacturing, and transport, will face what they call in bureaucratic speak significant disruptions, but only in 3 provinces: Newfoundland, Labrador, Alberta, and of course, Saskatchewan. The federal energy minister has acknowledged that it's unfortunate that the focus has been on taking things away, as in jobs. His spin is that the just transition will create opportunities for energy workers. There are a lot of cynics in this province about that. The federal minister has compared just transition to the Industrial Revolution. But of course, the Industrial Revolution wasn't about turning off the lights, turning off the heat, losing jobs, going backwards. At the very least, Mr. Chair, I think we all have to be honest about the cost. In a recent RBC report called the $2 trillion Transition, Canada's Road to Net Zero, it says, quote, to have a 50% chance of meeting a 1.5-degree warming target, which is the stretch goal of the Paris Agreement, the world will need to leave 60% of the world's remaining oil and gas, 90% of its coal in the ground. It goes on, quote, the amounts needed to transition could be hefty, around $2 trillion in the next 3 decades. Based on our estimates, governments, businesses, and communities would have to spend at least $60 billion a year, which is about as far as we can get if we cut Canada's emissions by 75% from current levels, as far as we can get with current technologies. That is a significant jump from the estimated $15 billion a year we currently spend. TD Bank as well found a couple of years ago that any green transition that is carried out too quickly, and I would add glibly, could result in 450,000 Canadian energy workers losing their jobs, not transitioning or not necessarily losing. So, Mr. Chair, that's the why. Now what happens when the Act is passed? An independent economic tribunal will be established, to which we can refer federal policies to define, address, and quantify their economic impact, put a dollar figure on them, which in turn could become evidence in a potential legal case, such as a reference to the Court of Appeal or an interlocutory injunction, one key test of which is irreparable harm. This bill is about core powers of the provinces versus the core powers of the feds at its root. It's also, though, about arguments around interjurisdictional immunity. The idea that legislation enacted by one order of government cannot interfere with the core of any subject matter under the jurisdiction of another. In theory, interjurisdictional immunity is applicable to both federal and provincial laws, but it's only ever been used against provincial laws. But at its heart, as I say, Mr. Chair, this bill is about exclusive constitutional jurisdiction of the provinces, defending that and the economic potential of our provinces. Finally, I do want to add, since this bill was introduced, it has generated considerable interest and discussion. And as a result, I understand we will be proposing some House amendments here today. I also want to remind committee members that the opposition voted for this bill at second reading in favor with us, and we do thank them for doing so. I'm happy to move to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Minister, I'll open the floor to committee members now. Mr. Lemay, I recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to inform the committee that I plan on moving an amendment to the bill. The amendment will read, nothing in this Act abrogates or derogates from the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada that are recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. Mr. Chair, at the beginning of this afternoon, I greeted President McCollum, and he presented a gift to me, this beautiful medallion that will be proudly worn in this in their legislature. I've had conversations throughout the province. I've had people reach out to me. I recently spoke at the Aboriginal business, the Indigenous business gathering in Saskatoon. Last year, we hosted about 300 people at that gathering, and this year it was over 500 people. Now, these are Indigenous-owned businesses that are relying on our economic growth and the partnerships that they're developing. And the energy was amazing. The sense of hope of what our future will look like in partnership, it was amazing. I've had interactions with many of them throughout my visits in the province, and And then I hear about the Métis communities, the First Nation communities. And many times I have questioned my role here as an elected official on this side of government. And I've sat in meetings where I had to wear the history of government. And so with many discussion, it is my pleasure that to put this narrative in the act that will protect the rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. We have the Métis community present here today, and I acknowledge them, I welcome them, and it is because I've heard what you had to say. I've heard what my First Nation communities have to say, and I've also heard from my constituents that have amazing economic opportunity in partnership of what they're able to do for our people. So with that, Mr. Chair, I plan on moving this amendment, and thank you to the Minister for allowing me the opportunity to, under your guidance and leadership, that I'm able to do this. Thank you.
Minister, would you comment on this before we carry on with questions?
I'll simply say, Mr. Chair, thank you to the member for Athabasca. I do want to thank you for your amazing, honorable engagement, support, collaboration as we have gone through these months together on this bill and on other issues. I think any way that we can reassure people, provide explicit clarity, as has been pointed out, treaty rights are already fully enshrined under Section 35, under all provincial legislation. But as I say, if there can be any clarity or reassurance to even one community or one person, I'm absolutely thankful for the input and the proposed amendment.
Minister, at this point, we'll open it up for questions. Ms. Sauer?
Thank you, Minister, for your opening comments. Thank you, Mr. Lemeg, for speaking and talking about your amendment that you will be introducing at a later time. We too have heard a lot of concerns about this legislation from people across the province, but in particular those First Nations and Métis leadership across the province. In particular, you know, Minister, what really matters is process and respect. And while this amendment is welcomed, this consultation process should have happened way before the bill was introduced. We have heard from many who wanted to speak with you, Minister, directly. We have heard many who've wanted to speak with the committee as a whole directly. The committee just voted against that motion to have those individuals speak and groups speak at this committee. We have received, and I understand you as well have received several letters, Minister, with respect to this legislation expressing concern. Despite the amendment that will be moved, there's still substance here about consultation and respect for leadership that I think it's important to still read these into the record. We've been requested to read these into the record, so I'm going to do that now and table them. And then, Minister, after, if you want to respond at the end, you're welcome to. First letter I have here is from Piapot First Nation, dated January 27th, 2023, regarding drawing the line defending Saskatchewan's economic autonomy and the Saskatchewan First Act. I am writing on behalf of the Piapot First Nation to express my nation's great concern regarding the Saskatchewan Party's paper entitled Drawing the Line, Defending Saskatchewan's Economic Autonomy, and the introduction of the Saskatchewan First Act. The Piapot First Nation declares that the Government of Saskatchewan does not have the legal authority to assert exclusive jurisdiction over the natural resources within the province. In 1930, the Federal Crown unilaterally transferred the administration and control over the lands and natural resources to the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, pursuant to the Natural Resources Transfer Act 1930 via the Constitution Act. First Nations have always maintained that this transfer was unlawful and it was done without the consent of nor even consultation with the First Nations. Further, First Nations have always maintained that we did not relinquish, cede, or surrender rights to the natural resources at the time of treaty negotiations. Rather, we agreed to open up the land for settlement, sharing 6 inches into the ground or plow depth for agricultural purposes. The Saskatchewan First Act completely ignores my First Nations' inherent treaty and constitutional rights to the lands, resources, and waters in this province. There is no consideration of my First Nations Section 35 rights, nor does it mention the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the treaties, which are all legal documents that have been completely disregarded by your government. Much of Canada's economy has been built from the extraction of natural resources from our territories. Your government shares revenues from the natural resources with the provinces and municipalities, but none of the benefits come to the First Nations. Resource revenue sharing with First Nations must be implemented to ensure adherence to the treaties. It has been an accepted practice in other jurisdictions in Canada, and it must become the standard in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. Moving forward, resource revenue sharing must be a priority for our provincial governments. Enclosed is Piapot's historical and current traditional land use study. We encourage all parties to immediately enter into negotiations with the First Nations right holders of the land, resources, and waters of the province. And this was signed by Chief Mark Fox of Piapot First Nation. The second letter I have to read into the record and then table is from Little Pine First Nation, dated November 4th, 2022. Dear Premier Moe, I am writing on behalf of Little Pine First Nation in response to your recent public delivery in the Battlefords on October 11th, 2022. Little Pine First Nation is an adherent to Treaty 6, which we signed in 1879. By virtue of the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Act, Saskatchewan is our partner in treaty today. The same NRTA was the subject of your recently released policy paper, Drawing the Line, Defending Saskatchewan Economic Autonomy. As you have referred to this as a white paper in the press, I will use your language to refer to it here. First, a note on your choice of words. We all understand that a white paper is a policy paper. However, it is dishonest to ignore the impact of those words, given that the memory of the 1969 White Paper lives on for every Indigenous person in Canada. The 1969 White Paper promised to eliminate the Indian Act and the distinct legal status of First Nations. Critically, it also attempted to transfer management of Indian affairs to the provincial governments. Government policy and legislation continue to advance the erosion of rights and assimilation in hope of elimination of the Indian. We, the leadership, and our nation members question why the Premier used words white paper, given your familiarity with history and Canadian politics. In response to the 1969 White Paper, the Indian Chiefs of Alberta drafted the Red Paper, demanding that the Crown continue to recognize treaty rights. Plainly, a reminder on the message of the Red Paper is warranted today. Quote, "To us who are treaty Indians, there is nothing more important than our treaties, our lands, and the well-being of our future generations." End quote. Mr. Moe, we are very concerned about the total disregard for our treaties, our lands, and the well-being of our future generations, evident in the White Paper as well as in other legal and policy initiatives of your government. Your new White Paper argues that Saskatchewan secured constitutional authority, in quotes, or control over natural resources in the province under the NRTA. It argues that federalism has held Saskatchewan back from reaching its fullest economic potential, in particular recent environmental regulations enacted by Canada. We will remind you that the protection of the environment is a responsibility we share as governments and a right and obligation under treaty. It concludes the federal environmental regulations will cost Saskatchewan $111 billion over the next 12 years. Other commentators have already noted that Saskatchewan's math does not add up. It is missing the economic benefits of the federal regime. This is not the most important omission in the White Paper. The most important aspects left out of your White Paper are First Nations and their rights to the lands and resources of this province. In essence, the province's control over natural resources is subject to First Nations rights under treaty. Our treaty sets up a balance between the rights of the Crown to develop natural resources and the rights of First Nations to continue practicing their rights, culture, and way of life. As BC's Supreme Court noted in 2021, quote, "The balance is not struck by allowing the province, in essence, an infinite power to take up lands," end quote. The duty to consult is intended to help the province and First Nations achieve balance. Please explain why your white paper left out any mention of First Nations, treaty, and the province's responsibilities and obligations under treaty whenever it is making a decision that concerns natural resource development. In order to increase Saskatchewan's autonomy, in quotes, the white paper suggests provincial authority over immigration, taking legal action to maintain control of electricity, fertilizer, and oil and gas, and drafting provincial laws to clarify rights belonging to the province. We agree that actions are needed to restore balance to the exploitation of natural resources in this province. However, the balance is in favour of Saskatchewan at the expense of First Nations. Natural resource development is occurring rapidly at the expense of First Nations rights, culture, and way of life, with no meaningful benefits coming into our communities. If you are concerned about the health of Saskatchewan's oil and gas industry, we do not share your concern. In fact, the oil and gas industry is credited with turning Saskatchewan into a net contributor to federal equalization payments for the first time in 2008, after 50 nearly uninterrupted years of this province receiving federal funding to advance its economic interests, no strings attached. Federal environmental regulations did not prevent you from toasting a $2 billion deal in our backyard in September. By contrast, our treaty rights, culture, and way of life are very much in danger as more and more lands in our traditional territories are taken up for development. In a recent interview with CTV News regarding the white paper, Premier Moe, you asserted that, quote, Section 35 is a relationship between Indigenous folks and the First Nations of Canada, as opposed to the province, end quote. Please explain what is meant by that remark. What is the relationship between the province and First Nations? What role does the province have in protecting First Nations rights, culture, and way of life? By refusing to mention treaty, is Saskatchewan saying that economic assimilation is the only option available to Indigenous peoples? In order to better understand drawing the line, we request, in the spirit of transparency, the following information from your government. 1, consultation on the white paper. Where and when were meetings held to discuss it? 2, Indigenous participation in the white paper. Which Indigenous organization representatives were invited to participate in consultations about the white paper? Who participated? As promised in the white paper, your government introduced the Saskatchewan First Act on November 1st. Legal scholars cited in the press have already noted the impotence of this legislation in effecting real change. It appears designed to send a message. Nevertheless, it concerns us that Saskatchewan's message omits its partners in treaty. As noted in the red paper, quote, everyone should recognize that Indians have contributed much to the Canadian community, end quote. We continue to do so. Yet Saskatchewan is drafting law and policy in a way that completely ignores us. Mr. Moe, how does the province plan to implement its obligations under treaty? How can the province provide certainty and minimize risk to investors if the province does not demonstrate the barest knowledge or understanding of its obligations under treaty, especially when it comes to natural resource development, as described in the White Paper and Saskatchewan First Act? Premier Moe, have you been invited to visit a First Nations community? On behalf of the leadership of the Little Pine First Nation, we invite you to come to our community and meet with us government to government to discuss the challenges we face as Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan so we can work on building a better relationship for all. Please extend this invitation to the Minister of your government that you would like to attend as well. Risk managing Indigenous peoples rather than relationship managing is not the way forward in building a safer and richer community, a more prosperous province, or a better country. Please have your staff coordinate. In closing, we request your written response to the questions we have raised in this letter. We look forward to hearing from your office about a date for you to come visit our community. And that was signed by Chief Donald Ironchild. The next letter I have is from Onion Lake Cree Nation, dated December 9th, 2022. Dear Premier Moe, I write as Okama of Onion Lake Cree Nation within Treaty 6 territory and overlapping both the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. As a nation bound by Treaty 6 within the Crown, we are deeply concerned with your proposed Bill 88, the Saskatchewan First Act. We call for its immediate retraction and for you and Saskatchewan lawmakers to consult with us before enacting legislation that attempts any reconfiguration of Saskatchewan's partnership, quote, within Confederation, end quote. Our ancestors, the sovereign Makau and Sikakush peoples, make treaty with the Imperial Crown in 1876. nearly 3 decades before the Dominion of Canada created Saskatchewan as a province. Promises and undertakings made by the Imperial Crown in Treaty 6 continue to bind the Crown in right of Canada and each of the provinces. Your Saskatchewan First Act purports to, quote, assert and confirm Saskatchewan's jurisdiction, end quote, without any acknowledgement whatsoever that, under treaty, you share the land and resources with our nation and other Indigenous peoples who first made treaty with the Crown. Our elders consistently remind us that we never gave up our lands and resources. We only allowed for the Crown's subjects to use the land to the depth of the plow. In particular, we note that there is nothing in the Saskatchewan First Act that acknowledges our treaty or other rights recognized and affirmed by the Canadian Constitution. Rather, we see a clear reference to the natural resources transfer agreements that unilaterally abrogated our treaty rights and fundamentally reconfigured jurisdiction over the vast resources of our treaty territory, all without our free, prior, and informed consent. Like the discussion of Saskatchewan First Act, there was also a lot of talk about sovereignty and self-determination in those NRTA negotiations, but certainly not our sovereignty or self-determination. The quote, Crown lands and natural resources, end quote, that you reference have been since time immemorial the same lands and resources that sustain the lives and livelihoods of our people. As a people, we have knowledge of our own Indigenous Nehiyawak law. Of necessity, we also have knowledge of Canadian and Western law. The Saskatchewan First Act, as introduced, is simply bad law. It fails to recognize or acknowledge our nations or any treaty nation's inherent rights and jurisdiction that were never extinguished. We cannot be legislated away, either by act or omission. The reference to Section 29A of the Constitution Act 1867 and to exclusive legislative jurisdiction indicates to us that you are trying to return to a watertight compartment model of the Canadian Constitution that has never been part of our Indigenous law, nor a durable way to live in a confederation. Section 2 of your Saskatchewan First Act complains of unconstitutional interference by the federal government bringing uncertainty, disruption, economic harm. This is also our all too familiar experience as a treaty nation. There is a better way forward for both our people and the people of Saskatchewan than posturing with bad law. We invite you to sit and discuss with us a better way along the path of treaty. In the spirit of treaty, this is signed by Okama Henry Lewis from Onion Lake Cree Nation. Onion Lake Cree Nation recently released a press release that they've also asked us to read into the record and table. This is dated March 15th, 2023. We speak on behalf of the leadership and members of Onion Lake Cree Nation. We are a sovereign nation that made Treaty 6 with the Imperial Crown, Britain and Ireland in 1876 at Fort Pitt. Our nation's lands now cross the boundary between the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Treaty 6 lands have sustained our ancestors for generations, and they continue to sustain our people. We have read Bill 88 and wish to make clear our opposition to the Saskatchewan First Act. Unfortunately, the plain words of Bill 88 reference and repeat the failures of the Crown to honor and walk the path of treaty, failures both recent and from nearly a century ago. The preamble to the bill references the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement 1930 as granting Saskatchewan full status within Confederation with autonomy over its Crown lands and natural resources. We have a much different recollection of the NRTA as an example of the unilateral derogation of our treaty rights to life and livelihood. Our rights to livelihood through harvest of those same natural resources were bargained away by the Dominion government without our consent. In fact, during the same time, the federal government amended the Indian Act to prohibit First Nations from hiring lawyers to pursue land claims and to advocate for our rights. Our rights to the commercial harvest in our traditional territory of our resources were extinguished by the NRTA. The autonomy that Saskatchewan claims in Bill 88 over its lands and resources came at the expense of our ancestors and our livelihoods. Our ancestors never gave up rights or access to our natural resources during treaty making. In fact, oral histories by elders in our nation tell us we were only allowed the Crown's subjects to use our lands to the depth of the plow. We still retain full access, control, and jurisdiction over the natural resources in our territories and in what is now called Saskatchewan. Similarly, Bill 88 references more recent changes to the Canadian Constitution in Section 92A, talking about jurisdiction over the exploration and production of natural resources. However, Bill 88 fails to acknowledge that Sections 91 sub 27 and Section 35 remain part of the same Constitution that binds the Crown and Right of Canada and the Crown and Right of Saskatchewan. There is no non-derogation clause in the bill with respect to our treaty rights. There is no mention whatsoever of our treaty rights. Rather, there are only assertions of Saskatchewan's exclusive jurisdiction, especially over natural resources. As our nation includes lands in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, we have voiced our concern over and challenged similar legislation that was passed in Alberta last year as the Alberta Sovereignty Act. That piece of legislation was introduced and then enacted wholly without consultation with us or with any other treaty nation. It too purported to unilaterally reconfigure our treaty and constitutional relationship with the Crown. Bill 88 is less ambitious than the Alberta Sovereignty Act, but the aim and reasoning behind Bill 88 still harms our nation in specific and ongoing ways. Apart from the lack of consultation in the drafting and introduction of Bill 88, this legislation, if passed, will entrench the province's disregard for the duty to meaningfully consult and accommodate treaty nations, especially when it comes to natural resource development. The passage of Bill 88 will clearly signal to treaty nations that the province's inadequate consultation framework is the means by which Saskatchewan will purport to balance our treaty rights with the economic priorities of the province. The sections of Bill 88 describing the creation and powers of the, quote, Economic Impact Assessment Tribunal, end quote, leave us no doubt as to whose fingers will be on the balance scale. Consultation will mean what the province finds it's convenient to mean. Accommodation will be a list of goodies co-drafted by bureaucrats and industry as the cost of doing business. Currently, there are sales, leasing, and other dispositions of Crown lands that are the traditional lands of our and other Treaty 6 nations. Those sales and dispositions have been made in the past, the very recent past, without notice, consultation, or accommodation. These dispositions take away our members' means of sustenance and livelihood. Similarly, project approvals without economic benefit to our people amount to our members' loss of the use and sustenance of our traditional lands. Whether it is a disposition or an approval, the province applies its own standard unilaterally to what the province figures is a potential infringement of a treaty right. These dispositions are just one example of the way in which the province is already showing us how the Saskatchewan First Act will work. Our Treaty 6 is a treaty with the Crown. Whether it is the Crown and Right of Alberta or the Crown and Right of Saskatchewan, our treaty binds the honour of the Crown. We now hold the Crown and Right of Saskatchewan to the same standard as that which we made treaty, our free, prior, and informed consent. Bill 88 obviously looks backward in time to the decades following the NRTA and before the constitutional recognition and affirmation of our treaty rights. For us as treaty people, it is also an obvious step backwards as well. This is signed by Okama Chief Henry Lewis. The next letter I have to read into the record is from Moosomin First Nation, dated December 12, 2022. Dear Premier Moe, I write as Chief of Moosomin First Nation located in Treaty 6 territory. As a nation bound by Treaty 6 with the Crown, we are deeply concerned with your proposed Bill 88, the Saskatchewan First Act. We call for its immediate retraction and for you and your lawmakers to consult with us before enacting a legislation that attempts to reconfigure or clarify Saskatchewan's partnership within Confederation. Our ancestors made treaty with the Imperial Crown in 1881, 25 years before the Dominion of Canada created Saskatchewan as a province. Promises and undertakings made by the Imperial Crown in Treaty 6 continue to bind the Crown and Right of Canada and this province. Your Saskatchewan First Act purports to assert and confirm Saskatchewan's jurisdiction without any acknowledgement whatsoever that under treaty you share the land and resources with our nation and others who first made treaty with the Crown. Our elders consistently remind us that we never gave up our lands and resources. We only allowed for the Crown subject to use the land to the depth of the plough. There's nothing in the Saskatchewan First Act that acknowledges our treaty or other rights recognized and affirmed by the Canadian Constitution. Rather, we see a clear reference to the natural resources transfer agreements that unilaterally infringed on our treaty rights and purported to change jurisdiction over the vast resources of our treaty territory, all without our free, prior, and informed consent. Like the discussion of Saskatchewan First Act, there was also a lot of talk about sovereignty and self-determination in those NRTA negotiations, but certainly not our sovereignty or self-determination. The Crown lands and natural resources that you reference have been, since time immemorial, the same lands and resources that sustain the lives and livelihoods of our peoples. As a people, we have knowledge of our own Indigenous Nehiyawak law. We have also have knowledge of Canadian and Western law. The Saskatchewan First Act is bad law. It fails to recognize or acknowledge our nation's or any treaty nation's inherent rights and jurisdiction that were never extinguished. We cannot be legislated away either by act or omission. The reference to Section 29A of the Constitution Act 1867 and to exclusive legislative jurisdiction indicates to us that you are trying to return to a watertight compartment model of the Canadian Constitution that has never been part of our Indigenous law, nor a durable way to live in Confederation. Section 2 of your Saskatchewan First Act complains of unconstitutional interference by the federal government bringing uncertainty, disruption, economic harm. This is also our all too familiar experience as a treaty nation. There is a better way forward for both our people and the people of Saskatchewan than posturing with bad law. We invite you to sit and discuss with us a better way along the path of treaty to ensure that the promises made in treaty last forever as intended. Moosomin First Nation joins other Saskatchewan treaty nations in calling for immediate retraction of Bill 88. This was signed by Chief Cheryl Kapiasewat, my apologies, from Moosomin First Nation. I have a very similar letter signed by Lucky Man Cree Nation dated December 13th, 2022, signed by Chief Crystal Okamal. I have a letter from Ochapowace First Nation dated March 14th, 2023 that we've been asked to read into the record. To Premier Moe, further to my statement to you on December 16th, 2022 at the FSIN Media Press Conference, I write to you today of great concern regarding your Saskatchewan First Act. Ochapowace Nation declares that the government of Saskatchewan does not have the legal authority to assert exclusive jurisdiction over the natural resources within the province. In 1930, the federal crown unilaterally transferred the administration and control over the lands and natural resources to the province of Saskatchewan pursuant to the Natural Resources Transfer Act 1930 via the Constitution Act. We have always maintained that this transfer was unlawful and it was done without the consent of nor even consultation with our people. Further, we have always maintained that we did not relinquish, cede, or surrender rights to the natural resources at the time of treaty negotiations. Rather, we agreed to open the land for European settlement, sharing only the top 6 inches of the ground or to the depth of a plow for agricultural purposes. The Saskatchewan First Act completely ignores my people's inherent treaty and constitutional rights to the land, resources, and waters in this province. There is no consideration of my nation's Section 35 rights, nor does it mention the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the treaties, which are all legal documents that have been completely disregarded by your government. Much of Canada's economy has been built from the extraction of natural resources from our territories. Your government shares revenues from the natural resources with the provinces and municipalities, but none of the benefits come to the First Nations. Resource revenue sharing with us must be implemented to ensure adherence to the treaties. It has been an accepted practice in other jurisdictions in Canada, and it must become the standard in Saskatchewan. Resource revenue sharing must be a priority for Saskatchewan moving forward. It was encouraging to see you wearing an orange shirt and participating in a First Nation healing walk on September 30th, 2022 in recognition of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Your quote on Facebook, quote, "Our government is committed to working with the Indigenous peoples of Saskatchewan on advancing cultural and economic reconciliation in our province," end quote, led me to believe that your words portrayed a partner relationship moving forward with us. I was appalled to hear your announcement of Saskatchewan's plan for total jurisdiction over our natural resources. I call upon you, Premier Moe, to uphold your words of economic reconciliation with our First Nations people. I also call on the province of Saskatchewan to repeal the introduction of the Saskatchewan First Act and immediately enter negotiations with us as the rights holders of the land, resources, and waters of the province. This is signed by Okama Margaret Bear. The last letter I have to read in the record is from the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. Dear Minister of Justice and Attorney General Eyre, I write to you today on behalf of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan and our Métis citizens in response to your letter dated February 16, 2023, and to reiterate our ongoing opposition and concern regarding the Saskatchewan First Act. While the invitation to meet informally and discuss the Saskatchewan First Act is welcome, it should have come in advance of the Act's introduction. It is disrespectful to our internal governance structures when the terms and participants of a meeting are dictated to us. If there is interest in having a respectful discussion as government partners, I would be pleased to meet with you as your ministerial counterpart at the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. Your government's position demonstrates a persistent lack of regard and care toward building a productive and collaborative relationship with the Métis Nation. We feel this is damaging to the long-term interests of Saskatchewan as a whole and will have a lasting impact on our relationships, our economy, and our future as partners. At the November 2022 Métis Nation Legislative Assembly, our government unanimously passed a motion rejecting the Saskatchewan First Act. This motion was passed through a democratic process and reflects the beliefs of our citizens. To reiterate the spirit of the motion, we view the Saskatchewan First Act as subversive toward our government and dismissive of Métis rights. The Act cannot stand. We are deeply disappointed that we have not heard from your government on this matter until now. In the spirit of reconciliation and given Saskatchewan's constitutional obligation to consult with Indigenous governments, we expect the province to work with the Métis Nation to rectify the issues identified in the motion. We are deeply concerned about your government's selective reading of the obligations set out in the Constitution Act 1982 as one of the Aboriginal peoples whose rights are recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of that document. We will not allow the provincial government to impede on our inherent rights by foregoing its constitutional obligations, including the honour of the Crown, and continuing down this dangerous path as set out by the Saskatchewan First Act. Our government wants to see Saskatchewan and its people prosper, including the Métis Nation. However, we firmly believe the denial of our inherent rights will impede any future prosperity of the province. We urge you to work with us and other Indigenous governments to build a Saskatchewan that benefits all residents. Finally, we have attached a copy of our Saskatchewan First position paper for your review. This is signed by Michelle Leclerc from Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. Not sure, Minister, if you have any comment before I continue on with my questions. You're welcome to.
I do, and I would ask for a copy of the letters, just to make sure we have all of them. Clearly a lot to, as they say, unpack from those, and I'll try to go through the notes that I made as I was listening to the reading into the record. I will say on the policy paper that was referenced a few times, I would, and certainly I believe anyone in our government would debate anywhere, anytime, Oxford debate style, the numbers in that policy paper. It was the Ministry of Finance numbers, and they are solid. If anything, they're too low. And the critics that I have seen discredit that report or that policy paper say they are discrediting, but not how. They do not line item or really go into any depth at all about the supposed flaws. So I do refuse to acknowledge things are flaws without proof of flaw. So that I would say off the top. On the NRTA, the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, this is in 1930. I wasn't born. Most of us weren't. It predates us legislatively and certainly jurisdiction-wise. It comes up as certainly a topic in a lot of the conversations that I've had with Indigenous partners, certainly that the member of Athabasca and other members have had. It is certainly a key context for the views on what land means, what jurisdiction means, and I understand and respect that position and that opinion and that context, but it certainly predates and is completely outside the realm of this legislature or of I or the government to address. So as I say, as we can't really get into the reality of why Alan Blakeney, with Peter Lougheed in the early 80s, pushed for the language exclusive jurisdiction. As I said in my opening remarks, the view was that exclusive jurisdiction was explicitly called for to counterbalance federal powers, and there was reason for that. But it predates us. And now that is the reality. It is in the Constitution. It is part of the division of powers. And what we are asserting is the meaning and significance of 92A in exclusive jurisdiction for the province of Saskatchewan. The reality, of course, is we have Section 35, as I said, enshrined in the Constitution, the same act that enshrines 92A exclusive jurisdiction. And we also have to remember that under the Provincial Legislation Act, Section 243, that also enshrines the protection of treaty rights in all provincial legislation. It is there. It was covered off in that section as a way of not having to reassert it in all pieces of legislation because it's there and enshrined. But as said in response to the member for Athabasca's comments about his amendment, certainly if it's being explicit here is of any comfort or reassurance or serves for additional clarity, explicit clarity, that is, of course, utterly acceptable. The key point which I have raised with Indigenous partners as I have spoken with them, and I'll get to the meetings in a minute, is, again, this is not our language. It is the language of 92A and the Constitution, namely exclusive jurisdiction. That is something that has been of concern as if this is suddenly a new concept driven by this Act. It is not. It is a constitutional language reality. Legally speaking, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, 92A exclusive jurisdiction was a key component of the carbon tax argument in terms of what was offered and put forward by the province of Saskatchewan and continues to be with Bill C-69, the Federal Environmental Impact Assessment Act. As I also referenced, 92A was exclusively referenced by the Court of Appeal. That makes its way to the Supreme Court next week. I believe 10 provinces and territories are joining with Saskatchewan in a united view that Section 92A means something in the context of coming up against that Act, and that the importance of exclusive jurisdiction under 92A is under attack by that Act. And that was agreed by the Alberta Court of Appeal, which, as I said, mentioned its being federal overreach being a wrecking ball, constituting a wrecking ball to 92A. So to the point that, and I think it's an important point, that these are policies and federal legislation which, in arguing against them and for 92A, didn't trigger duty to consult because of their policy nature, not perhaps project nature. And the member also referenced legal scholars. I have a similar view on that to my views on the white paper. I have responded, we have responded to those concerns. One of them was on the fact that we were supposedly adding new powers to the legislature through the Act. But as I said in my opening remarks, in Section 3 of our Act, we are merely asserting and enumerating the province's exclusive powers. That I know was one concern. Another was on the amendment. The argument was that this should be handled similarly to, for example, the CPR case. However, that was made under Section 43 of the Constitution Act 1982 because it was an amendment affecting, quote, one or more, but not all the provinces. Section 45 is for unilateral amendments, and that's what we are dealing with in this bill. So again, I have not seen any legal argument that holds a great deal of water in reference to this bill in terms of the constitutional aspect of it. Interjurisdictional immunity is another issue which has been raised by legal scholars, and it's fascinating. And we hope that its time has come in terms of the province's ability to argue it. And as I say, the hope is that the doctrine will make some headway. For example, in the case of PHS Community Services, the BC Court of Appeal was ready to make a determination in favor of the protection of provincial interjurisdictional immunity over a safe injection site in that case. And the justice emphasized the dangers of so-called cooperative federalism having negative effects on provincial policies. It eventually went to the Supreme Court. There was much talk about delineating cores of provincial powers and the failure to do so in this case, but several scholars have supported the idea of provincial paramountcy, and we hope, as I say, that its time has come, Mr. Chair. The federal government has acknowledged that the bill is constitutional, and of course, the opposition voted in favor of the bill, which, as I say, thanked them for their support off the top. At one point, the member referenced that this is somehow about ceding control, and I think I have covered that off, ceding control over natural resources. Carving out something new is the implication. It is asserting what is already in Section 92A, not creating new powers, and I think we've been quite clear on that. In terms of consultation, listening, dialogue that I have had, and certainly I've been joined by a number of colleagues along the road, including the member for Athabasca, the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Government Relations, among others. And I have met with a number of groups over the last couple of months. I had a very cordial meeting with Chief Bobby Cameron, Chief Evan Tapetat, Chief Heather Bear. Most recently, a couple of weeks ago, met with Meadow Lake Tribal Council. It was a productive dialogue. It was about listening. It was about getting across what the Act is, and I've gone through that a number of times, and what the Act is not, and how it is not a violation of treaty rights in any way, but how it does assert the powers we have as provinces against federal policies and legislation that hurt us economically and thwart our potential. And I was disappointed that members of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan couldn't sit down with us. Recently, we had tried to arrange a meeting for a number of weeks, if not months, and that was canceled. There was then an attempt to meet with regional members. There was no call, no cancellation. A number of us were at the meeting, and they didn't call or come. So that was unfortunate, but we will, hope to certainly hold a meeting in due course. PA Ground Council had a sudden conflict. We were set to meet with them. They were having to go to Edmonton, as I recall, and we're working to reschedule that meeting. Other meetings are being planned, including with Saskatoon Tribal Council. I know Chief Tapetat has reached out and asked for me to come to tour the community. There's a welding operation and so on, and we're working on dates around that. But really, frankly, Mr. Chair, whoever wants to meet, whoever wants to talk about this Act, we are happy to do it. And we have nothing to hide, certainly, as partners really in the economy has been the steady narrative, the steady message. We have everything to gain. And when I speak with members of these communities, what does the resource sector mean to you? The responses are poignant and the responses are direct. An enormous amount. It means an enormous amount to them. I think of the uranium sector, for example. We know that Cameco, as just one example, has traditionally been the leading employer of First Nations in the country, in the forestry sector, in the mining sector as a whole, as critical minerals come on, as important in our economy and in our province. There is such enormous contribution, such enormous momentum. And really at its root, this act is about economic potential and protecting it. That is the key, and it is about economic potential and protecting it for everyone in this province, and that is the key.
Do we have any more questions? Ms. Sauer?
Thank you, Minister. Just one comment, because you've mentioned it twice now. We voted to move this bill to committee so we could get the voices of First Nations and Métis leaders to this table to be able to speak to the committee and yourself about this bill. That's why we wanted this bill to committee. Your committee members have decided to vote no on that request. So we've read the letters into the record. The concerns that I just raised were not the concerns of myself or the NDP. They were the concerns of First Nations and Métis leadership in Saskatchewan, Minister. Specifically on that, and you've spoken about it a little bit, but I would like a specific list of who you consulted with in terms of First Nations and Métis leadership prior to the introduction of Bill 88.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Like to caution people that are viewing this committee tonight that you are not to participate in the actions. It's just for committee members, so please respect the committee. And no clapping. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I would first of all say that to the point raised by the member that regarding the motivation for voting for this bill, there was a bill before the House yesterday on the martial aspect of the Police Act, and that was voted against by the opposition. I think we have to be clear that if the motive is about debating things at committee, that happens anyway, and it really is of no consequence whether in terms of the ability to discuss or get into acts further, that whether something is, the voting for it is not the point, because the debate and discussion occurs in any case. And as I say, I would have thought that the bill that was voted against by the opposition yesterday would also have equal importance in terms of potential voices being heard, as will occur at committee as a matter of course. In terms of the list of people whom we have spoken to and communities and members of Indigenous communities and so on whom we have spoken with, I went through the list of meetings that I have had that we are working to set up and continue to set up. The listening certainly continues, the dialogue continues in some cases. The term consultation has been an issue, so I don't want to call it that. With respect, it has been more about listening and dialogue. And really, and I've gone through this now in terms of the intrinsic nature of treaty rights being protected under Section 35. So in terms of the view we had going into this, it was very similar to the protection of exclusive provincial jurisdiction, which we considered important to fight in the carbon tax or in the Bill C-69 case as an intervener. We felt it went without saying that because Section 35 enshrines treaty rights and because treaty rights are enshrined in every piece of provincial legislation, that it was a very similar argument really on the exclusive jurisdiction side to what we were had gone through and continue to go through when it comes to asserting that exclusive jurisdiction, as I say, under 92A. Strictly legally speaking, and the member did reference scholars, this act is not a reconciliation or an accommodation agreement, so it doesn't legally on its face engage the the proverbial honor of the Crown. And in the Courtauray and Canada case, the Mikisew Cree Nation lost when they argued that there was a duty to consult on the development of legislation. The Supreme Court held that when ministers develop policy, they are immune, if you like, from judicial review, which is what the Mikisew brought an application for in this case. But aside from that and the strictly legal view of this being called into play, really the sense was, the conviction was, because it is simply intrinsic, that Section 35 enshrines treaty rights, same Constitution as enshrines exclusive jurisdiction over natural resources under 92A for the provinces in this country. And it is also intrinsic in all provincial legislation under Section 243 of the Provincial Legislation Act. So that was the feeling. The sense was that this was about protecting the economy. It was about policies that are either in the mix or to come, which could jeopardize everyone in the province. And that remains the driving motive, the driving narrative.
So I'm going to ask the question again because you didn't answer it. What specific consultations have you, Minister, had with First Nations and Métis leadership prior to the introduction of Bill 88?
I have answered that, Mr. Chair. And this creates no new powers. That was also key to consideration of how this goes forward, and the member has herself asserted that this creates no new powers. If it asserts what's already in the Constitution under Section 92A, and we have fought a carbon tax over 92A, and we have fought as interveners in the Bill C-69 case under 92A, it's about 92A. And it's not about carving out anything new. It's about asserting what is already in the Constitution. And as I say, Section 35 also in the same Constitution. So really there is no question that treaty rights are in any way in jeopardy because both are part of the Constitution of this country.
Hey, Minister, this is a very simple and direct question, and it's a question that's asked often when we're at Bill Committee. I asked for a specific list of who did you consult with in terms of First Nations and Métis leadership prior to the introduction of Bill 88.
I, in turn, will say that I use the term consultation very, very carefully because I have been asked to by First Nations partners whom I have spoken to, that they are concerned about that language. They prefer it to be about listening. They prefer it to be about dialogue, and that these do not constitute formal consultations. So I'm not going to say I engaged in formal consultations. In a loose sense, in a dialogue sense, in a conversational sense, of course, those conversations go on every day in terms of what drives the province and what we feel is important to protect from an economic perspective for the province. And that's what drove the bill. And so formal consultation, I believe in the sense that the member means, as with the carbon tax, as with Bill C-69, didn't occur because Section 35 already enshrines it, and it is already enshrined in terms of protection of treaty rights under all provincial legislation. So this was already protected.
Minister, I'll use a term that you prefer then. Who did you have a dialogue with about Bill 88? If the answer is no First Nations and Métis leadership prior to the introduction of the bill, could you provide a list of who you had a dialogue with about Bill 88 subsequent to Bill 88 being introduced?
Well, the language around whom did I dialogue with or whom did we listen to, whom did we speak with, will have to be something that we we present more formally to the member. I would worry about leaving anybody out.
This is something, Minister, that often your officials keep track of, at least in previous bill committee debate. There's usually a list that has been compiled that can be provided to the committee at committee night. Is that before you today? If not, why not?
Again, I say, Mr. Chair, that I use the language consultation very carefully because I have been asked to. So I'm not going to presume to say that I had formal consultations because I have been asked to not use that language by Indigenous partners whom I have spoken with. That this is about listening and it's about dialogue. And if we get into creating a list of whom we as a province listen to and dialogue with, what timeline do we employ? I guess I would say that in terms of lists, I can list scores of people whom I have met with from Indigenous communities who have talked about the importance of natural resources to them and their communities. And so I count that as part of what drove this act, is the economic protection of everyone in this province. And so as it came to be in development in terms of what it meant to the province and what it meant to the economy, that list is, of course, includes everyone in the province. And so I think I hesitate to say a formal list of consultation when treaty rights are already intrinsically protected under Section 35 and all provincial legislation, because we do that in order to ensure that that is clear, made even clearer, I hope, by the member for Athabasca and his amendment this evening.
Minister, I'm giving you a very specific timeline and on a very specific topic. And again, if you prefer the word dialogue, I'm happy to use that. Have you had a dialogue with in terms of First Nations and Métis leadership since introducing Bill 88 about Bill 88? This is not a trick question.
It is a trick question, but this is not a trick answer. When concerns were raised about the connotations of the Act, the meaning of exclusive jurisdiction, which, as I've said, is not our language, it's the language of the Constitution, broad concerns about the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, which of course has nothing to do with the language of this Act, and so on, we endeavored to meet with and listen to First Nations and Métis partners and stakeholders, and we did that. And in terms of, for example, the meeting with Métis Nation, which was cancelled, that was weeks in the works, as I say, if not months, that when those concerns began to be raised, and again, we had felt going in, truly, I can say, because protected under Section 35 and intrinsic in all provincial legislation, and because those same arguments had been used with, for example, the carbon tax case, that was a given. That was a given that was protected and that they were protected, which of course it is, and they are. But once concerns were raised about some of the implications or potential implications, we immediately endeavored to set up dialogue sessions, if you like, with those who were concerned, and we continue to do that. And that work goes on. It's disappointing that having been asked to meet, and then endeavoring to establish a meeting, that was cancelled with no explanation. And I'm speaking specifically in this case about Métis Nation, but also unfortunate with PA Grand Council. Things happen, people are busy, I do understand, but we are continuing to endeavor to set those meetings up to really walk through everything that I have, namely that there's nothing new that is created, only established, which is asserted. And I think that's very important, and really the message that we are all in this together.
I mean, I think they would take issue with you saying that we're all in this together, especially when you can't even tell us who you've dialogued with, met with, listened to. These are nations that deserve and want to be consulted, dialogued with, met with, listened to, not after the fact, but prior to introduction of legislation like this.
May I just say, Mr. Chair, as I've said, I mean, prior to the fact, as I've mentioned a number of times, because Section 35 enshrines treaty rights, and it is enshrined in all provincial legislation under Section 243, we felt that it was a given. But once concerns were raised, there was then an undertaking to meet with those who are raising concerns, and I have listed them. Chief Bobby Cameron, Chief Evan Tapetat, Chief Heather Bear, 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago or so, members of Meadow Lake Tribal Council. Certainly I can provide the full list. There was a group of about 10, I would say, members there on that occasion, and certainly I can endeavor to get the full formal list, which I don't have in front of me, and read it into the record after our break. There were council members also at that meeting from Meadow Lake Tribal Council, and subsequently had set up, I believe for the next day, a meeting with Métis Nation, which was cancelled, with then regional members, which was cancelled. PA Grand Council, we had intended to meet the same day. We were going to meet with Meadow Lake Grand Council. They were called to Edmonton. Saskatoon Tribal Council, there's been some back and forth in terms of dates that work better for them, and that is being set up. And as I say, I'm happy to, I've indicated to Chief Tapetat that I'm happy to come. I know there's an election in the mix toward the end of this month, is my understanding, so to work to meet with him and tour the community and talk about the Act or whatever's on his mind and the people of the community's mind when that works for him and them. And so it goes. I think that the real focus has been on clarifying to them, but also to the Chamber of Commerce, the College of Law, the Canadian Bar Association, SARM, what the Act is and what it is not. And very similar really to what I stated in my remarks at the beginning, which is, I think, important to clarify.
Minister, you just mentioned meeting with leadership of the FSIN. As you know, there are 11 First Nations that are not members of the FSIN. Did you meet with, listen to, dialogued with any of those First Nations either prior to or after the bill was put forward?
I have met with those whom I have listed. In some cases, there was a certain amount of leaving it to them in terms of who was invited or whom they wanted to be there. So certainly we were willing to work with them on that. And as I have said a number of times, whoever wants to meet, wherever they want to meet, whenever they want to meet, we're happy to meet. And that has been the message. In a few cases, as I say, meetings were canceled or called off at the last minute. That's unfortunate, but we have also indicated that we are happy to move forward and have these discussions. I know one of the things that Chief Cameron mentioned to me was that it was a shame I couldn't spread the word to 70 other chiefs in that case, and I said, whenever it works for them and whenever it works for you, I'm happy to do that. And so it goes. I think that has been clear in terms of certainly what has motivated me, which is to clarify what's in the Act and the whys of the Act, and to address concerns. And as I've said, when those concerns were made, I think there were certain things, for example, around the NRTA, Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, which had to be clarified that it's just not within the ambit of if you like, of this bill, and certainly predates it and is a reality separate from it. And so this really is just about asserting exclusive jurisdiction under 92A for the province.
Minister, there are many people who are listening to this committee this afternoon, and many who feel very disrespected by the way this bill has been introduced and by the way the dialogue around this bill, both prior and subsequent, has been handled. At a time of reconciliation, this was absolutely the wrong move by this government and sends a pretty stark message to First Nations and Métis leadership throughout the province. Minister, what do you have to say to them?
Well, as I say, I think it's been incredibly important that since concerns have been raised that listening and dialogue occurs and has occurred, and I have taken that very seriously and certainly have treated the concerns seriously that emerged. I think that the amendment by the member for Athabasca this afternoon, certainly the intention is to, as I say, reassure and clarify, and if it serves as a reassurance for one person, one community, that's important, or any clarity. Again, it is already enshrined in Section 35 and all provincial legislation in terms of the protection of treaty rights. So this merely reasserts that explicitly. But again, I think that in terms of what message it sends, I hope it sends a positive one. I think sometimes lost in the mix a little bit, again, is really the motivation for the Act, which is the protection of economic potential for everyone, including First Nations and Métis in this province. And I came across the other day an article by Stephen Buffalo. He is the president and CEO of the Indian Resource Council. And he talked, among other things, of precisely the issues that we have been touching on, and I touched on in my opening remarks, which is really economically harmful policy. And I mean, after all, it was the auditor by the federal government, and it was the Canadian Auditor General who concluded last April that Indigenous groups are disproportionately, as it was put, burdened by carbon pricing, for example. And that's the same carbon pricing that we've been referencing in terms of 92A and what we advanced in the carbon tax case. And the quote was, in one headline, the carbon tax policy hurts community, region, and northerners. In another one, and this was Stephen Buffalo's line, life on reserve is already unaffordable, the carbon tax makes it worse. And that really is what drives this in terms of, yes, Indigenous communities, yes, Northern communities, all communities are impacted by some of these policies. And so it's really what I talk about, including to First Nations, when I talk about the need for the Saskatchewan First Act to assert ourselves against economically harmful federal policies. That really is the core. And so the sense was that this really would be something that was necessary to protect economic potential. That's been the message all along. And if it is of comfort that it be explicit that this has importance in terms of the language of, for example, the amendment, then I think it is necessary to reassure. That has been the effort all along since concerns were raised, to reassure.
Minister, you and the committee have chosen not to refer this bill to the Court of Appeal. A reference case could provide some certainty into the constitutionality of the legislation, which you've expressed already this afternoon, confidence that it is constitutional. Certainty, as stated in Section 2 of this bill, is described as one of the reasons for this bill. As a result, why not send it as a reference now, understanding that it's likely to be challenged?
Well, we feel very secure in the constitutionality of the Act, and certainly Mitch McAdam can elaborate as he sees fit on that. I think, interestingly, I mean, in terms of raising the Court of Appeal, I mean, one of the reasons for the Economic Tribunal, which will put a dollar figure on economic harm by federal policies, is to gather important evidence, if you like, for a potential reference to the Court of Appeal. And in terms of some of the thresholds that we've seen around you know, a necessary injunction, for example, on that side of things, as I stated earlier, it's a very difficult threshold for an interlocutory injunction. One of the tests, however, or thresholds, is irreparable harm. And so we felt that it's an important component. It's something we maybe haven't talked about at great length so far this evening, but on the Economic Tribunal side, and the purpose of it, which is established, of course, under this Act, to put a dollar figure on some of these policies. And as I say, to Mr. Buffalo's point about the economic impact on Northerners and on reserve, for example, of the carbon tax, you look at, you know, the federal fuel standard would be another one. I mean, there's a direct component of diesel, cost on gas, cost on fuel, cost on heating, which for all people in this province would constitute economic harm. So to the point about the Court of Appeal or a reference, or to my mind, an interlocutory injunction, I think one of the important things about the dollar figure on some of these economic policies would be for precisely that reason, to buttress a legal case on that side of it, which is on the economic harm side. In terms of the constitutionality, we are very confident that it is constitutional for all the reasons that we have gone through a number of times. And certainly, Mitch, you can elaborate if you'd like to add anything.
It's Mitch McAdam from the Constitutional Law Branch at the Ministry of Justice. I think what I'd like to say to start with is it's really been a fascinating experience to work on developing this legislation. We're not asked very often in the Constitutional Law Branch to work on amendments to the Constitution, or in particular, amendments to the provincial Constitution. So it's been a really interesting task. But I think when it comes to the question of whether it's constitutional or not, the starting point has to be Section 45 of the Constitution Act 1982. And Section 45 very clearly says that the province can unilaterally amend the terms of its own constitution. So in our view, there is really no question that the province can amend its constitution to put in a statement like that Saskatchewan has autonomy over all of the matters falling within its exclusive legislative jurisdiction under the Constitution Act 1867. That is simply a statement saying, you know, we have this exclusive jurisdiction. It's not an attempt to change the division of powers that's set out in Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867. It's simply a statement asserting that the province has certain jurisdiction. And, you know, we are confident that the province has the authority to do that under Section 45 of the Constitution Act 1982.
What does asserting jurisdiction do legally?
Go ahead. Well, when we've asserted jurisdiction vis-a-vis the federal government, I think you've heard the minister speak very clearly about the concerns with federal inroads into matters of provincial jurisdiction. It was certainly a matter that led to the carbon tax challenge. Again, in the Constitutional Law Branch, we don't do many reference cases to the Court of Appeal. We haven't challenged federal legislation very often in the 30 years that I've worked in that branch. But the government felt strongly enough about the carbon tax and the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act that we were instructed to take a reference case and to argue that that legislation was unconstitutional because it encroached on matters of provincial jurisdiction. And as you know, ultimately we lost that case. The Supreme Court said that the legislation was valid. But the thing that I like to point out to people when I talk about that case is the federal government had to resort to the Peace, Order, and Good Government Clause in the Constitution in order to have that legislation upheld. And that's basically arguing for a constitutional amendment that's recognized by the courts, as opposed to proceeding through the amending formula set out in the Constitution Act 1982. So we had that concern. We went to court with respect to the carbon tax. We ultimately lost, and I think the minister has elaborated on other issues, other initiatives that the federal government is taking that cause similar concern. So what we've done in the Saskatchewan Act is we've asserted that we have jurisdiction. We're not trying to change that jurisdiction. It's just, in my view, it's drawing the line in the sand and saying, this is where our jurisdiction is, and we're going to defend that jurisdiction. And so that's part of the Act, and then other parts of the Act, like the sections dealing with interjurisdictional immunity, sort of expand on that. And as the minister has pointed out, we believe that those provisions will have some impact if and when we end up in court arguing about these matters again in the future.
I hear you, Mr. McAdam, and I will never pretend to understand the Constitution better than yourself, sir, but what does asserting jurisdiction in provincial legislation actually do legally in terms of legal weight? You've mentioned previous reference cases and such.
The way I view it is it's a statement by the provincial legislature of the significance of the jurisdiction and the concern about the federal inroads. As I said, it's not an attempt to change the jurisdiction. It's not an attempt to amend Section 91 or Section 92 of the Constitution Act 1867 to give the province more jurisdiction. It's just saying we're serious about the jurisdiction that we have, and we're going to protect it.
Sure, but what does a statement in legislation do? And do you have any jurisprudence for ways that's happened, that's been successful in the past?
Well, as I said at the outset, this has been a novel exercise, and it's been an interesting exercise, and it's not one that other provinces have embarked on. So there aren't a lot of precedents for us to follow. So I can't point you to any case law that's considered a clause like this where a judge has looked at it and said, this is what it means or this is what it doesn't mean. But as I said before, we think it's an important statement for the legislature to make about the importance of provincial jurisdiction, about the importance of the exclusivity of that jurisdiction, particularly with respect to Section 92A and natural resources, given the history behind that amendment. And the minister has already alluded to that. So that's the way we view the amendment, as that sort of important statement by the legislature about what our jurisdiction is and an indication that we're prepared to defend it.
But just to be clear, you're not changing.
I might just add, Mr. Chair, too. I think it's also important, I mean, in terms of the weight of this, and it's one of the things I talked about in my opening remarks about how we feel that enumerating core provincial powers within the context of 92A has practical weight, but it also can potentially have legal weight. And one of those was around regulations, for example, and infringement, which we see federally in the actual weeds of specific equipment that can be used. For example, we see that one of the reasons that we are intervening in the plastics case, which of course was argued last week in federal court, is around, again, jurisdictional infringement. And the fact that the federal government is not allowed, and that has been established by courts, to infringe in provincial regulations. of specific industries. That's not said in the carbon tax decision. That's not said anywhere. It is something which is increasingly happening. We see it in the methane space is another example where the federal government is saying you can use that kind of equipment, you can use that kind of equipment, not something they can do jurisdictionally, and that is an infringement, and that is a constitutional infringement. So we feel that, for example, enunciating, elucidating what, for example, regulation is part of that 92A core exclusive power, and it is, and that's established as such, something new about that. So again, I think that was very important, and we feel that that was it was certainly bold to assert within the provincial constitution and also to enumerate those core powers. And as I said, previously, in terms of that unilateral amendment under Section 45, which Mitch has referred to, Quebec did it. And so, again, Section 45, unilateral amendment, Quebec did it. The Prime Minister said it is absolutely legitimate, perfectly legitimate, quote, for a province to modify the section of the Constitution that applies specifically to them. Different reasons for assertion in terms of Quebec. Different things that drives their current, cultural and other narrative, if you like. But for us, 92A, protection of natural resources, exclusive jurisdiction, of prime focus and importance to us. And so, again, I think that really the question of the constitutionality is not a question. It isn't in question.
Okay, but Minister, on what basis do you think that this statement will have legal weight?
Well, for all the statements we've been really making for almost 2 hours now, and I don't mean to be glib. I mean, there are, not only the assertion of 92A, but the amendment of the Constitution under Section 45, the fact that we feel that it bolsters interjurisdictional immunity points and arguments, that there is emerging jurisprudence in that area, which we hope could be of weight, legal weight, in terms of saying Saskatchewan amended its Constitution under Section 45. It asserted exclusive jurisdiction under 92A. It enumerated its core powers and listed such things as regulation within those because that is being infringed, and that potentially, if it comes to a Court of Appeal reference or an interjurisdictional immunity argument, all of that is bolstered by the Economic Tribunal and putting a dollar figure, sole remit, dollar figure, on some of these economic policies. I think that is really not been questioned, that to, for example, achieve interlocutory injunction, which can be very challenging to do, and one of the tests of which is irreparable harm. How do you prove irreparable harm? In this case, you discuss it economically, in terms of economic harm. And so I think that taken all together, even within, for example, the federal paramountcy argument, which has also been raised, well, the province, it'll all get struck down anyway because of federal paramountcy. And I mean, if you have competing federal jurisdiction, provincial jurisdiction, there are some people who have said, and there are some courts which have held, that a federal paramountcy, is paramount. But there is equal emerging jurisprudence which shows and holds that federal paramountcy cannot be used as a hammer, and that there is also provincial paramountcy. And we see that with 92A. And so I think all of this goes to the buttressing on a number of fronts, clear buttressing within clear powers to making the case. And I mean, I believe the member has said on certain days, this really is nothing new. I don't agree with that, but it certainly isn't carving out new powers.
A lot to unpack there. I'm going to focus on Mr. McAdam, specifically talking about the novelty of this. And you yourself, Minister, said that you disagreed with me saying that there's nothing new in this legislation. oftentimes when there's uncertainty about legislation, in particular when it's dealing with the Constitution and division of powers and the like, governments will refer bills or legislation to the Court of Appeal for a reference. Understanding that perhaps another organization will seek to do something similar, perhaps to, if only for expediency's sake, perhaps to allow organizations to save money in having to file their own application. Why won't this government refer this bill to the Court of Appeal?
Well, I'll answer first, and certainly then Mitch can go from there. I mean, to quote the member, she wasn't quite sure what there is to review. In one comment she made that she felt that, as I say, there wasn't anything new in this because it asserts what's already in the Constitution. And forgive me, I don't have the exact quote, but that was certainly the premise. When I say that I disagree with the fact that there's nothing new, it is only because of first of all, the fact that it is a new thing, certainly within Saskatchewan, to amend the Constitution by virtue of Section 45 of the Constitution Act. But as Mr. McAdam has stated, that provides explicitly that a provincial legislature can unilaterally amend its own constitution, and that in turn gets back to Prime Minister Trudeau's quote and the fact that Quebec did it. So that's established. I think what's new is the Economic Tribunal. That is a major component of this, which is that, as I've said, an independent tribunal will look at federal policies and put a price on them. And that flows from this act. That is new. The enumeration of core powers we felt important, and it's explicit, and it's within the Act. So it's not just stating, restating 92A. There are components of it, the enumeration of core powers, the amendment, of course, allowed under Section 45 of the provincial constitution, and the flowing from the Act of the Economic Tribunal. So that's what I mean when I say I don't believe it's simply already existing. It is in the sense of 92A, but we go beyond that into enumeration of core powers and the Economic Tribunal, and have also amended our Constitution unilaterally. So there are new components, and so to the member's previous comments that she wasn't, I know in one case, a constitutional expert and didn't feel there was anything new in the Act. I would simply say that there are components and elements of the Act which make explicit certain things and do certain things, such as the unilateral amendment under Section 45, that are, I believe, bold, but not carving out of any new powers. Mr. McAdam, if you want to add anything.
The only thing I would add, Minister, is what I said earlier. I think we're very confident that the province has the authority under Section 45 of the Constitution Act 1982 to make an amendment to the province's constitution to assert its jurisdiction over matters that fall within Section 92A, the non-renewable natural resources. So I think we're very confident that that jurisdiction exists. I know that one of the other questions that was asked was, well, what effect will that have? And we do think that it will have some effect, that it's something that judges can look to as an interpretive tool. And when you're arguing a constitutional case in front of a judge, we, for the province, will argue this is why we think this is important for provincial jurisdiction. This is why we think that the inroad or invasion of jurisdiction by the federal government is significant or serious. And of course, the lawyers for the federal government will argue the opposite. And when you're making those sorts of arguments, it's always difficult to know exactly what to say. You look at constitutional principles, you look at history. I know in cases that we've done, we've gone back and referred to the constitutional debates from the 1860s and tried to glean something from them that might be relevant to the case today. So we think that having an amendment like this put into the province's constitution is something else that we can point to in those cases, and that it is something that judges can rely upon as an interpretive aid, and that it will make some difference in those future cases.
And I will just add, Mr. Chair, I know one of the questions that came up last week, even around the plastics intervention, was this about plastics? And aside from the factual policy arguments around it, and there are some interesting ones, I mean, for example, that, you know, one could say it's not appropriate to lump in, you know, plastic to toxic substance lists set by the federal government, which includes asbestos and mercury. Or the fact that as you ban plastics, some of the substitutes for plastics end up actually creating more of a carbon footprint in the landfill and other situations. All those things aside, one of the key points here, as in so many cases, has been infringement by the federal government in provincial areas of jurisdiction. Plastics, methane, electrical vehicles, the clean electricity regulations, which will state by 2035 no fossil fuel generated power. If anyone is in any doubt that that has an economic impact, let alone a social impact, let alone an impact for the North and for all communities across the province, let they make that argument, because that's extremely challenging. Let alone to the point about the white paper or the policy paper, the dollar figure. How do you put a dollar figure on no fossil fuel generated power by 2035? I mean, these are massive and have massive significance for the province. So you can say, well, your number is this or that, but you start to hammer those things out, and you start to look at that infringement again and again and again of federal policies, clean fuel standard, as I say, methane regulations, into the economic realities of this province. And you have an issue in terms of jurisdictional infringement. And I think to Mr. McAdam's point, I mean, if you look at the Bill C-69 case, Court of Appeal of Alberta, as I've said that the federal government, with its Environmental Impact Assessment Act, had taken a quote-unquote wrecking ball to 92A, provincial exclusive jurisdiction. What are all the things that one could then argue as a province going forward confronted with some of these policies? And again, how do you put a dollar figure on no liquid natural gas in Canada, shutting down Saguenay? How do you put a dollar figure on that for us, for the whole country, for Germany, for Japan? I mean, this thing becomes, it has really, some of these policies have global scope. So I think part of the thing is buttressing. When we say buttressing, we mean as some of these policies roll forward and become realities, and we see that with the federal fuel standard, as I say, into 2023, this year, what are all the things we can argue? And we can argue politically, but we can also argue potentially legally that we amended our Constitution unilaterally under Section 45, which we are allowed to do under Section 45, to assert our constitutional jurisdiction over 92A, which is right there in the Constitution, fought for by Alan Blakeney and Peter Lougheed, 1981-82, as a counterbalance to federal overreach. How prescient? How prescient? And as a result of those important arguments, interjurisdictional immunity, countering the idea of federal paramountcy, obtaining an interlocutory injunction potentially over some of these policies coming through. That was attempted previously with the carbon tax, and it's an extremely hard threshold to achieve. So again, one of the tests is irreparable harm. We feel that establishing economic harm could potentially prove irreparable harm. All of this goes to addressing harmful federal policies, and the dollar figure is significant for the province, but also for the country.
Thank you. It now being 6 o'clock, we will recess till 6:45 and reconvene at that point.